Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to yet another edition of the Halal Food Podcast. Today we've got two important guests with us from the USA, from an organization called ISA. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time. I'm going to invite them one by one to introduce themselves so that we'll go straight into the podcast. So first of all, brother Jalal, do you want to come introduce yourself first, please?
Sure. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you for having us on the podcast today. My name is Jalel Aossey. I'm the current president of Islamic Services of America and Halal Montreal Certification Authority. Originally based, ISA originally based in Iowa, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, starting in early 1975. And Halal Montreal was actually founded right around 2009 by Brother Hajj Taibi and his organization. And in late 2018, we acquired Halal Montreal and have been operating it as a sister company to ISA, which is based in Canada. So it's been a long development and one that has many challenges, but alhamdulillah, we still have the energy to keep going forward.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. It's good you mentioned Brother Taiba. I met him in Malaysia in 2013, I think. Yeah, I met him. Very nice guy. I met him with a wife.
Excellent. Yes, Sister Najat.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So I'm gonna go to Brother Tariq to introduce himself, please.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum. My name's Tariq. I'm born and raised in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where ISA is located, Islamic Services of America. After studying at the university here in Iowa, I graduated and had the opportunity to study overseas, Arabic and Islamic studies. And currently, I'm the director of Sharia Islamic Law Department for ISA.
Yeah, you said you've had the opportunity to study overseas. Are you being trying to keep a low key, or why are you not mentioning where you studied? Is it in Saudi, in the UK, or where?
Yeah, I was blessed to go on a scholarship program to the University of Medina in Saudi Arabia.
Mashallah. That's good. You should have mentioned that in the first place so that we know you are the man.
That's the part. I had the opportunity to study for some years, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. So first of all, I wanted one of you to explain when ISA was formed, what you do or what you initially was set up to do, and what you currently do. So if you can take us through the scope of your activities.
Sure. You know, I think Dr. Awal, part of history you're going to find here is maybe similar to what many other certifiers that have been around for a number of decades started as. And to that effect, I go back to the beginning with the explanation of how my father started ISA, along with one or two others at the time in the organization who had since passed and moved on. If you look back at the history, and now I'm speaking more historically from the standpoint of the United States, and the history of the Islamic movement, is that you look at when Muslims first started coming to the United States in larger population groups, and amongst our families, immigration started, including Tariq's as well, and many others in the Cedar Rapids community, started in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, when there were a number of Syrian immigrants that had moved from various parts of the world, but in particular our area of Syria, over to the United States and immigrated into the Midwest as farmers. Some of them farmers, some of them peddlers, some of them small tradesmen, and others. And through the years, having that Midwest upbringing, there weren't many opportunities to travel at the early stages. And so when my father had attended college, which was Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa, and graduated from there in the 1963, actually. If you recall, for some that are out there that remember this, the Peace Corps had just been formed by President Kennedy. And my father joined the Peace Corps, is actually the first Muslim in the United States to join the Peace Corps in the United States. And he was sent to Dakar, Senegal at the time, and spent his first few years working with the people, local indigenous peoples there, And he was actually also their wrestling coach. For those of you that know my father, may know not this part about him, but he was actually a wrestler in high school and in college, and a pretty good one at that too. So he had taught the Senegalese wrestling team that was there. And after his time that he was in the Peace Corps, he and another one of his friends had decided to travel rather than go back to the United States. They decided to travel. And obviously, I'm trying to condense as much of this as I can, but they traveled throughout North Africa and Middle East and Asia and went back home. And in the late 1960s, then at that point, my father and my mother had the opportunity to go to Saudi Arabia with Raytheon and help teach technical English at the time. They had stayed for a short time and then came back to the United States. And around this time period, the growth of international trade, and in particular in the Middle East, was growing. There was obviously petrodollars that were coming in, and they were needing to spend those and develop their countries. And so my father had started receiving inquiries from friends, both in Asia and the Middle East, that they were looking for products, services, things from the United States. And obviously this is before the internet. And so he would receive letters saying, "Dear teacher, our family is in the construction business. Can you help us source such and such items?" Or, "Dear teacher, our family is starting a restaurant organization." And so one of the things that actually started before ISA began, and actually has been well documented and sometimes even debated and discussed as to how it came together, was he started originally Midamar Corporation in 1974 as an export trade operation. It was shortly about a year or so after, in 1975, when ISA began as the halal certifying body. So at that point in time, if you look at the context of what halal was in the United States, it was unheard of in many cases. So the halal market didn't necessarily exist at the commercial and industrial level that we know it is today. And so when ISA was formed, it was formed, as I said, like many other small certifiers and such at the time, is that there were requests for halal food products to be designated for exports to foreign markets that were growing. And in the early days, for those that remember, the complexities to which we have today and the standards and certification extent to what we have today didn't exist at that time. And I think that's a very crucial point for our industry to be aware of. And if you look at the history of the kosher market as well, in the early days of the United States, they went through very similar evolutions. And so in the early days of the halal market, it really focused predominantly around meat and poultry. And so in the early days, that's when even certificates were still mostly done by the Islamic centers at that time, that private organizations slowly came into being in that way. And so when you look at the context of the growth of whether it was ISA or others at the time, it really began out of the need for export development at the commercial level. Whereas halal certification on a local level was more so with either the imam or the local people in the community that had handled it. So the early days of ISA really began at that base, but the historic context of ISA actually started as a dawah type organization, giving out information, printing books and pamphlets to give out. It started in that facet first, and then the halal certification came afterwards.
So at the minute, can you just let us know what do you certify? Do you certify banks for Islamic finance? Do you certify just meat, or do you certify non-meat products as well?
Sure. So the predominance of what ISA does is actually in the non-meat and poultry sector, although we do have meat and poultry. And as we go into this discussion today, we'll go into more about why to some extent. While I was saying, I think, not to get too far on a tangent, but I think the area of Islamic finance, halal lifestyle and halal tourism and all these other areas are growing and will eventually come into their own with regard to standardization. It's really at this time not our current focus.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that Midamar was first formed in 1974, whilst ISA was then formed a year later. That means that ISA was formed 20 years before the UK had its first halal certification body, and that was in 1994, around 1994. So that is very interesting to note that
Sure.
that was the
And
case.
keep in mind, it again, as much as it has a historic background, remember it was a very infantile existence at the time, right? It wasn't the same that it is today. And so, while we do say that, we are the oldest and one of the pioneers in this area, the evolution of this industry is what's amazing when you actually get in the details of what's happened, especially as you mentioned, whether it's a UK or other areas, and then including the growth of the Islamic economies in Southeast Asia and others, where they really developed the strength of the halal certification bodies.
Yeah. So we're now going into a question that somebody living in the UK, working in the halal sector, I've read about, and I'm sure many people have also read about, that involved ISA and Myanmar. Now, this case, although many stories have been written, many people have commented on it, I have never had a direct conversation with you. And I believe many people, many key stakeholders would want to hear from the host's own mouth what really happened, what was the case about, and whether there has been any improvement, whether you have made
Sure.
any changes in order to avert any of that thing happening in the future. So, first of all, I want you to just say, look, this is what happened, this is what we're doing, and this is what the future looks like.
Sure.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to say I appreciate you giving the platform to speak about this. I believe what you're asking, and to be specific for those that maybe aren't familiar, is that there was a court case against the Aossey family, Myanmar Corporation, the ISA, back in 2014, 2016. So to understand what happened and to truly give it another perspective, to which up until this time on a public level, it's been very limited.
Yeah.
You have to go back to the beginning of why would an organization, or what happened over the course of from February of 2010, when our first inclination that there was an issue that came up, until mid 2016 when it ended. So you're talking about a 6-year period of time here, and trying to then condense that into an explanation that will leave the listeners with a better understanding. It may not give a full grasp, but at least give some understanding. But more important is, what have we learned from it?
Yeah.
What are the opportunities for others out there?
Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, people will cast their judgment one way or the other. That's expected. And so obviously, with the world we live in today, you have to explain it, and then be content with whatever the determination of those that are out there, make their decisions and go forward. So with that, what I want to say first at the outset, there was a problem, there was a wrong committed, we paid the price for it, and you move on from there. So I don't want anyone to think for a minute that we're trying to minimize or bigger mistakes than others. But what I think is important to know is that, again, when you look at the case from what the prosecution had tried to put out there was that, let's just call it the organizations or the family. They tried to make the case that selling non-halal product. If you read the details of the case and really what the charge was against, it was about the USDA export documents showing that meat from plant A was really from plant B, and that was fraudulent on the export documentation. If that's the focus of what we look at, then that was what happened. It was sold from one plant, which was misrepresented, but the quality of the meat, the actual slaughtering of the meat, everything else was correct. The problem was, it was a wrong decision, and it was a bad decision, and it represented a very minute portion of the total sales of the organization. And I think if you look at the details, and if people will stand back and say, well, okay, that doesn't explain though why there was so much attention brought to your case. And there's a reason for that. And I think that's the part that people that knew us closely, and the ones that were familiar because they were part of the process, they started asking questions. The ones that were on the other side, that were interested in the downfall, so to speak, of the organization, or a downfall of the family, or downfall of what we represented in the halal industry, they didn't have an interest, nor was there a purpose to try and give us an opportunity to interest was, and you see this in other situations, not just in our own, that if there's a certain direction that someone wants to follow, and this prosecution wants to follow, they're going to do everything as your voice. And so what we realized in going through the process, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, why do you think that you're not going to be tested like those that came before you? Why do you think that you can say you're a Muslim and not have to, without at some point having to deal with the wrong committed? But how are we going to adapt to that? How are we going to move forward? And so that standpoint of it, we've been looking at this opportunity and say, what are the other pieces of information that people need to hear about? So with that, you go back to the mid 2000s.
Hello?
Things did they do? Did they eat? Where are the places they went to? Historically, our family and organizations have been very heavily involved in the Islamic communities, supporting events, organizations around the world. And so, especially my father, in many cases, was a very strong advocate. The post 9/11 environment offered opportunities to start sorting Muslims in different categories, right? And in certain cases, especially in Iowa had always been historically a very open community to Muslims because they've been there for so long, for nearly 100 years. So we received a number of inquiries from governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations. What is the halal market? What is it that people are eating? Where are they coming from? How do they interact? And so we had been very active in that effort. In addition, what we found is that over a period of time, the definition of the word halal evolved, because no longer did it simply just mean permissible, but it meant to some different standards, to which historically in the 70s and 80s and even up into the early 90s, there wasn't that level of in-depth context in the Sharia aspects being involved in it. And so we had to start getting into conversations about what was halal, because if you recall, at the same time too, international trade was evolving with the advent of import regulations being lifted in many countries. There were food products coming from the United States and the United States, as we all know, is a major food supplier to the world. And so as you looked at it, we found that there was definition of halal being used on one side. Then you had, in the international realm, you had the Codex Alimentaire, if those are familiar out there. They had some old definitions in there. Yep. You had standards, whether they were then at that time posted on the internet about what halal is and is not. And then on top of that, you also had GSO, and you had others that had randomly been out from different countries.
Yeah.
In 2006, I was asked to speak at one of the first World Halal Forums in Malaysia. At that time, I had given a presentation, I believe it was in the 2006 one. I had given a presentation about the halal supply chain. And I said, one of the challenges that are going to be faced in the next generation of the halal development is Muslims do not own the supply chain. And so when you're not involved in the supply chain of halal production all the way to the end, you have less leverage in the industry. And I say that from the standpoint of being in a non-Muslim country, where when you look at why do people build slaughter plants, and again, I'm focusing this conversation predominantly on the meat and poultry industry, because that's where the court case evolved, not on the other areas, is that meat and poultry plants are developed for an economic purpose in Western countries, right? They don't look first as to whether they actually meet a religious requirement. They look first to say, do they make financial sense? Then they look at other aspects of it. And so what had happened over the course of the last 20 to 30 years in the United States and even in other countries around the world is that the standards and development and the efficiencies that were lean from lean manufacturing and other areas of operational development had come into play to such a level that what was originally seen as, let's say, hand-cut chicken and poultry or beef with no stunning had evolved into much more rapid development. What failed to evolve was there wasn't anyone really looking at for how that's going to impact religious production of meat and poultry. So what had to fast forward at this time is that there was a deficiency is probably the best way to put it. There's a deficiency of how we're going to be able to adapt and move forward. And I think the challenge that came was that by not being in the supply chain, we were on the fringe as an organization and as an industry to try and educate. And so there were organizations and companies that were willing to be educated about it, but they just didn't have the means of either implementing it, or in some cases, they just didn't want to do it. And I think that was one of the challenges that.
Okay. Brother Jalal, I wanted to come in here. One very, very important point you made was that the case was not involving the misrepresentation of non-halal as halal, and it didn't put anybody's life in danger. But I'm talking about food safety. So there was no food safety issue involved. There was no non-halal issue that was, or non-halal meat that was sold to Muslims as halal. Because from Muslims, from the Muslim consumer point of view, they want assurance that nothing of that sort happened. Can you just be emphatic and say, yes, that is what I meant, because that is what I heard you say? Is that what you really meant?
Yeah, so the main issue, again, had to do with beef that was approved for export from one facility.
Yeah.
And beef that was not approved for export from another facility. Both facilities performed halal slaughter, but the approval, so in the US, we have plant by plant approval. So the approval for plant A was such, but plant B, for example, was not approved. And so the meat from plant B was marked as from plant A because so it could go over there. But the beef was halal from the beginning. That was never contested.
Okay.
The issue is that when the government action started to come against our company and our organization was that we had been speaking about the industry itself at a number of events, whether domestic or international. Mm-hmm. And in my particular point, we had been speaking at an event overseas in the Middle East. And I had mentioned that there are products on the shelves in the Middle East from American companies that by any contention were not stating on their websites, were not advocating that they were producing halal, had no halal certification, but the products were there. They were on the shelves and it was evident. The thing is that I was then targeted and perceived, as well as our family organizations, targeted by certain U.S. meat and poultry organizations and governmental groups as saying that everyone was doing it wrong except for us, which was not true. And the problem with that is they were saying that you're just doing this to speak only for your organization. I said, that's not true. I said, look, contact these organizations, call them up, email the organization and ask them. If they tell you that they're doing halal, then that's a separate matter, because then at that point, they can then have the discussion with you on whether it's a certain type of school of thought that they're following or a certain process. But if the company is telling you that, look, we've never been certified halal, then ask, how is their product ending up overseas as halal? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we started to get a reputation amongst these organizations and a few of the groups over there. And I'm trying intentionally not to specifically name some of these just for the sake of the discussion. But let's just say that we started to get a reputation for saying you're troublemakers. I said, well, again, I was much younger in those days, in the 20s or so, or I suppose it wasn't 20, maybe early 30s at that point in time, before all the gray hair set in. But at a younger age, you're a little bit more fiery, right? Sometimes you're a little bit more naive in certain cases too. But at the same time, you look at it going, look, this is wrong. One way or another, it's wrong. Yeah. And I said, so if we're in this field, and for those that are in this industry, I think they'll appreciate this. When you're a halal certifier, you bear a great responsibility, no doubt, because you ultimately are accountable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for whatever it is you're representing. Yep. And on top of that, if we see a wrong that's being done and we don't speak up about it, then are we not also accountable to some extent? The challenge is that when I was looking at it from the context many years later, and what could have been done different or otherwise, it's in the explanation of bringing together the governmental groups, the certifiers, the organizations that oversee trade, because even today, that's what's really missing. I think you came from some of these recent halal events or expos and so on.
Yeah.
How many government organizations actually send their trade representatives there? How many actually send the industry association presidents and heads to speak? And how many and I'm talking not just from the Muslim countries, I'm talking about from the non-Muslim countries. Yeah. We have to integrate those individuals into these discussions, because what happened in our case, and again, I'll make it emphatically clear, and this is even the judge in the case came out and said in the transcript that this case is not about halal. No. But the way it was perceived and the way that everything was written about it, absolutely, there's no way you can walk away from this, from all the media publications, without thinking it's only about halal. But if you look at the details and you say, well, why did they attack you so much? Why did they come after you? It's because the fact that we were speaking about what was going on was wrong. And there's the way that the easiest way actually to see why or how you could validate what I'm saying is ask the USDA to present all of the export documentation for the meat and poultry products destined to certain areas of the Middle East over a 10-year period of time, and look at the products that were going over there. Ask then the companies at those particular times, were they ever certified? They weren't. Many of them were not. Those are facts. They just simply have to be asked. So that's what I mean. So I'm saying, don't take my word for it. Just do your own research. Yeah. Aside from that, though, like I said, though, this is not about trying to minimize what happened in our case or say it's only wrong was done to us. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that what was the goal? The goal was to try and improve the halal integrity of what Muslims are eating and to help follow certain standards. And that's true whether it's in our organization or amongst the others. And the reality is that many in our industry are either fearful of explaining how this industry has evolved, or they're, in some cases, overly arrogant about what they've always been doing, to which they may or may not have been doing. And the thing is that I get it. At the end of the day, I get it. People are looking for opportunity. They're fearful. Many of them also come from countries where you don't get a chance to speak out openly about what you really think is happening or is happening. And so they have to be mindful of that. And so in this particular case, where we want to transition, and I say we being not just us, but the industry, is to openly address, without pointing the finger and without accusations, what are the real challenges to provide halal food, in particular meat and poultry in this case, halal food to a growing global population that I think recently, just was it in the last few months, turned 8 billion, right? I believe the statistic is that we're now 8 billion. And I think we reached 9 billion in another 15, 20 years or so. So if we're going to feed this kind of growing population, how do we do that when, again, almost 1/3 of the world population is going to be Muslim? And amongst that, in the meat and poultry world, there's about 5 or 6 countries that supply the predominance of meat and poultry to the rest of the world. So again, this isn't an attack. It's a wake-up call more than anything else, saying, look, I've got my sins that I have to deal with on the day of judgment. Inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant me at some point, but I'm doing my best to make sure that I rectify that within our organization, within the family, within the industry, and we're not going to give up on that. And that's where we're going to keep going forward. So if I can answer any more, I will. But the real history of the court case and all of the other facets of it, there's a book waiting to be happened on that part of it, and I'll put all the details in there, all the juicy tidbits that everyone wants to know about, and we'll make sure that it gets out there. But the broader picture today is about what do we have to do as an industry to understand the true challenges and not just focus on hand slaughter and mechanical and debate that for hours on end. There's deeper issues that we have to address. Yeah. I mean, the thing is that, one thing I want some of the viewers to take away and understand too is that one of the major failings in our organizations, and I say our organizations because again, people say, oh, your family has a trading company and it has a certification. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is if you don't have the proper compliance measures in place and the proper systems in place to ensure that the integrity of the processes are maintained. And that was a problem that we had many years ago. And what I say for that is because for those of you that grew up in family-oriented businesses, especially in an ethnic culture, is that as coming out in the late 90s, as I did from college at that time and working in the organization, I noticed that we had to professionalize. We had to professionalize at a level that hadn't taken place for many years. And by no means am I disparaging anything that my father or any of the people at the time worked for any of the organizations did. But what we've recognized is that you had to evolve. And that's where, to some extent today, as much as we find that the ISO way has worked its way into the halal certification industry, there are some pluses to that. There are also some negatives to that too, because it doesn't take into context the Sharia aspects as well as it should. But the point is that you have to professionalize in this industry, and what we are seeing today across the globe for the halal certifiers, there are many certifiers who are taking that serious and moving forward, and there's some that are still operating like it's 1980, and unfortunately you can't do that. And where, as you mentioned, brother, too, that there's frustration in some organizations is that the application of a standard can vary greatly, which I'm sure Brother Tariq will get into as well when it comes to the Sharia aspect. So there are particular trade organizations or governments that want a certain standard to be followed, even if within the Sharia it maybe is a fringe allowable option. And what we're trying to do, and Tariq will make that transition for what we're doing to talk about what has transitioned. He will make that transition into the standards that we're starting to put in place that will give the consumer the education and the power then to determine what they want.
All right. Thank you very much again, Brother Jalal. So I'm now going to invite Brother Tariq to just take us through what ISA is doing now to improve processes and also improve standardization so that we do not get a repeat of what happened, and also we can look into the future. So Brother Tariq.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina wa Habibina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam kathira. So one of the themes and cultures that we find in the meat industry in particular is a culture of secrecy, right? What happens behind closed doors? What happens in these meat slaughterhouses and these processing plants? And of course, the narrative or the excuse is that for animal rights activists, they're always afraid of how that might adversely affect their business. And that's not in line with what are our values of human values, but also where the market trend is going, where there is a higher demand for transparency in what it is that we put into our body. Unfortunately, in particular with meat, many halal certification bodies, as an observer outside, well before I ever started working in this industry, I noticed that culture was transferred to them as well. where there isn't a level of transparency, or at least maybe not a sufficient level of transparency on standards. Now, that's not for everyone. No, some are very good in publicly saying what it is, what we stand for, what are our standards, what is halal, et cetera, et cetera. However, it does exist. And so one of the focuses that we're trying to have at ISA is that transparency, is understanding exactly what is going on in the industry, and in particular, again, on the protein side, so on the meat and poultry. And so in 2012, ISA had initially started, and this was long before I ever came on board, but they had developed standards, set standards to express different views amongst what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so since my onboarding, this has been a project that we focused on to revamp those standards. And again, with the goal of making it as transparent as possible to the consumer. Yeah. We'll speak, I'm sure, about some of the ideals or objectives to achieve a global standard. But I think it's important to understand that there's only two main options you can do when trying to reach one standard. Or two outcomes. Either it's all one strict global standard, that way it's more inclusive for different opinions, or it's going to be a mix, or somebody's going to be in control of it. Really, there's no other option other than that. And so our goal was to show that, no, there are different opinions out there, valid different opinions out there within fiqh, within Islamic jurisprudence. And so we want to represent that. And that was the main, so this research project and our different standards called the ISA HS standards or Halal standards. We have a certain set standards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for poultry as well as for beef. And so what the foundations of this research and these standards, number one was fiqh, Islamic law. And what developed or what went into developing the Islamic law side of it, which was the most important building block of it, was to rely upon the relied upon opinions, or what's called the mu'tamad, in each of the 4 different schools of thought within Sunni Islam. And that was taken through their relied upon books. So not just any book, but no, the most agreed upon, relied upon books within each madhab to study in depth the nitty-gritty details of Kitab al-Dhabh, the chapter dealing with slaughter, Kitab al-Sayd with hunting, and to extract, then take those opinions, look at the most pertinent issues that we face in our times with modern technology, stunning, animal welfare, slaughter, the required blood vessels, the slaughter men, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the pillars and the conditions of slaughter, and then to extract these rulings based upon each one of their madhab to represent what would be allowed in, for example, the Maliki madhab, what would be allowed in the Hanbali madhab, and so on and so forth. And so what we did was, in our highest standard, or our HS1 standard, that will be an inclusive standard within Sunni Islam. And I say Sunni Islam just because within the different sects of Islam, they have different jurisprudence. Yeah. And so we're just not as familiar with them. And in particular, one of them is facing the Qibla, that the animal has to face the Qibla. And there is an agreement amongst the Sunni scholars that that is not a requirement, and the practicality in many existing plants already. So the highest standard would be HS1, where that's going to be acceptable by all the different madahib. Now, the second component from the fiqh, I said that there was 3 main foundations that went into this research project. Yeah. The first was fiqh. The second component of the fiqh was also to look at the maxims of fiqh, what's known as al-qawa'id al-fiqhiyya and usul al-fiqh, the principles of fiqh. How do we derive rulings? How do we take, for example, modern day issues which have limited research from a fiqh standpoint on discussing, that are always changing, and then try to give an Islamic or apply an Islamic ruling according to that specific issue. And then, of course, we examined modern scholarly research on these issues, such as stunning, such as machine cuts, poultry. Now, on the second major building block that went into these standards was the scientific research. And this was based upon some of the most recent and up-to-date research articles on halal stunning, on I'm sorry, on halal slaughter, on stunning, on animal welfare issues, on meat quality. It also was conducted using interviews with specialists in the field. Dr. Awal, Jazakumullah khairan. You were extremely generous with your time. We had very, very fruitful conversations regarding some of these scientific issues and how to bridge the gap with the fiqh understanding and the scientific. Very, very fun issues that we were able to discuss, like the brain death issue and the heart. So I really, really enjoyed and benefited from your time. It was instrumental in developing some of these standards. So Jazakumullah khairan for that. And then also with your book and your podcast, the interview with Dr. Temple, as well as her studies in this field. And then the third major foundation that went into this is the technical realities, the economics, the practicality. Yeah. You can have something from a fiqh standpoint on paper, be theoretical. And then you have from the science, same concept, based upon a certain sample size. But what happens on the ground? If you have, for example, all the protocols in place, all the standards in place, but no one knows how to manage them, or there's lack of training, or there are outside influences, economic influences. Let's just produce and improve our bottom line as much as possible. Then you're not going to be able to apply many of those standards, or they might not be practical. Sure, in a ideal case study, this is how it will work. But on the technical side of things, it doesn't work out that way. And so we also considered that, and that was based upon slaughterhouses that we've been to, visited, even conducted our own essentially scientific studies, as well as our experience in this field. We have our QA director, Yassine Tabal, who, mashallah, has been in the industry for many years and really a leader in his field. And I greatly benefited from his experiences and his review and what he built into the standards as well. So that's been a main focus of ours, these halal standards. We're very excited about them and to release them on our website, on our social media platform, again, with the goal then that the Muslim consumer has more control. Let's stop fighting about, and I know that will always exist, but some of these issues, and again, we can discuss them more in your follow-up question, the stunning and this is acceptable. No, listen, here are certain scholars and groups that accepted, for example, hand slaughter.
Yeah.
If you want hand slaughter, this is our highest HS1 standard. But recognize also that there are other standards out there that are also acceptable based upon, relied upon opinions within the madahib, the different schools of thought, as well as many modern day scholars and fiqh councils, and that would be a lower standard. I will say though, and it's important to add that you will always find outliers, or what's called views that are considered shadh, outlier alien views that are a minority within Islamic scholastic work. So for example, that any meat that's from a Christian or a Jew, no matter how they slaughtered, is acceptable, right? It is a view within Sunni Islam, but it's considered an outlier. And for us, we still remained within we tried to still, because of the great responsibility that is on our shoulders, we tried to stay still within mainstream and side on there of caution with regards to some of those issues. And so those would not be acceptable in our standard. Stun to kill would not be acceptable in our standard. And again, we can discuss that more.
Let me just come in here, Brother Tariq. You mentioned the HS1, HS2, HS3. That is an excellent concept. But the question I've got for you is, even within the USA, have you had dialogue with other certifiers who may be willing to replicate what you're doing, or you haven't started such a conversation? If you have, is it going positively?
So excellent question, Dr. Owell. That is part of our phase 2 once we release and publicize our standards. And that's exactly what our goal is, to reach out to not just the certifiers, by the way. So we've already reached out to some major du'at that I have relationships with to review, as well as we'll be reaching out to some fiqh councils. But that is the goal. to reach out to some of the halal certifying bodies, allowing them to know that these are our standards, this is what we accept, and if we're going to work together on certain cross-certification projects, it has to comply to some of our standards, and it has to be known. Will it be positive, to change your question? I hope so, inshallah. I hope we all share the goal in trying to be transparent and sincere and help the Muslim Ummah, but we'll find out. I'll keep you posted, inshallah.
Yeah, and also I think this one, Brother Jalal can come in. Brother Jalal, apart from talking to certifiers with the new standard, how would you communicate the standardization, the different criteria to the consumer? Because the consumer is very important. The consumer needs to understand which one is HS1, which one is HS2. How do you plan communicating this to them?
So the best way of answering that, Dr. Aossey, is to go back to what the historic roots of ISA were. If you remember, it was an educational organization.
Yeah.
One of the things that we need as an industry, and even within ISA, we're still working on it, and we'll continue to work on it. And I mentioned this actually at the last World Halal Food Council meeting, I believe it was in 2019. What we lack as a global industry is an association that represents the educational base to what you're asking the question about. How do we reach the consumer? And again, I give a lot of respect to the kosher industry. We need to learn from the challenges that they have dealt with in the advent of their systems and organizations and how they reach their consumers. And they have a very strong network. And from that aspect of it, on a very local level within our organization, is something that we have, but also everyone else has too. And that's the scale of social media that's available and free to get information out. And among the different types of systems and processes that exist is developing, and this is where it, again, if we're able to bring certifiers together, interested parties together, and find an area that we can agree on as far as these standards, and what we're hoping to be the case is to create the educational base from the elementary level, for the young children. Even the simple thing is, what is halal? Why is it important to me as a Muslim? I mean, again, we got to have to start with the children. This is not going to be something we're going to achieve in 1 or 2 years. This is going to be a decades-long practice, but we have to remain patient. I mean, again, the kosher industry took 50 plus years to really get up and evolve and grow, and they're still going through their evolution. And likewise within our industry too. I always used to joke that years ago, decades ago, I used to say when I get asked, why in these events and such, they say, well, kosher is the same as halal. Why don't you guys just accept that? And say, well, kosher is an alternative, and we put that in as one of our standards. It is one of the alternatives. However, it's not the only one, nor is it what you have to accept. And I said, look, the halal industry is the little brother, but little brother is growing up right now. Yeah. Little brother is getting bigger, and it's ready to take its place at the table. But we have an obligation to make sure that we provide the educational base to explain that. And to your point, we have an ISA consumer division that is working on the educational materials to start providing out there. Obviously, it would be much more expeditious to have a group or an organization that would all tie together and fund it to get it out there. And we're still hopeful for that. But in the absence of that, it's something that we're taking on. And as I mentioned, creating an elementary level, maybe more of a scholastic level, and then obviously more at the advanced collegiate levels as well. So we have programs, and we've actually had some initial discussions with a few colleges and universities to put certificate-based programs together for these institutions to help them understand, as a non-Muslim, also understand what they should look for, how they should be able to answer, because they oftentimes get questions from their Muslim students and from others in the industry or from their corporations as to how to effectively manage and put in place a halal program.
Yeah, one thing I must commend ISA for doing is I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I do see some articles that are written by your organization. I don't know whether it's a monthly thing, every 6 months or yearly thing, but I do see some articles that are there, and it's something I always try to encourage certifiers to do, because there are so many topics to cover that we could just do. Maybe just do, even if it means writing 500 words every month, just educational, something to educate the consumer on. I think it's something that we need to sort of encourage.
Sure.
Now, my other question is to Brother Tariq. Brother Tariq, when you contacted me that you were writing a standard, and we had our first meeting, the questions you were asking me, to be honest, I was a little bit surprised, because you were trying to understand, to apply your Islamic knowledge or your fake knowledge with science. Why did you decide to take this route? Why? Because we don't see that in the halal city, in halal industry. Normally, they say the scholars work independently from the scientists. And I wrote a paper in 2017 and said, look, scientists and scholars need to come together to share knowledge. Why did you decide? Did you read my paper, or why did you decide to take that route?
No, because فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. And the people of knowledge are whatever who are knowledgeable in their respective fields. And this was a tradition that has been very rich and still exists to this day, alhamdulillah, within our Islamic tradition, which is whenever there is an issue that relates directly to a specific field. So if it's an issue related to medicine, if it's an issue related to engineering, if it's an issue related to political relationships, Allah Azza wa Jalla has a ruling for every single issue and will until the day of judgment. But how is that deduced? Is through ijtihad. And I'm not saying that we're doing ijtihad by any means. We're not qualified to do ijtihad. But one of the essential things is that you work with the specialists in the field. And you'll see that statement throughout our books of fiqh. وَهَذَا الْأَمْرُ يَرْجِعُ إِلَى أَهْلِ الْخِبْرَةِ. And this issue, in order to develop the ruling, or to see if the ruling will change from one set of time to another set of time and place, it goes back to the people of the specialists in the field. And that's essential. And considering that we have so many of these issues that are scientific based, and in particular veterinary science, it's crucial then to consider that in order to develop standards and Islamic ruling. And like we touched on before, one of the hottest topics, stunning. Stunning. Well, in order to discuss the stunning issue, you have to understand, as you've written about, the difference between how do we define death? Is it through the brain, or is it through the death of the heart, cardiovascular? And in this particular case, many important issues branch off of that. Now, many people will be surprised. I'm amazed every single time I do research on any topic, how rich our Islamic fiqh and culture is. How even modern day issues, you will find a precedence for it within our Islamic books of fiqh and tradition. And at one point that I found in my research that we discussed is because Islamic fiqh, it's dealing with law, it's not as, for example, binary as true death and true life. No, they're more complex, and they will divide it into true life, what's in the ruling of life, what's in the ruling of death, and what's actual death. And that then gives you a much better understanding then of how to apply these issues, because then it's not as difficult. We can say that, well, we don't really know, is the animal alive or dead? Well, then it's either going to go in, it's ruled as alive or it's ruled as dead. And then that's where you can study the differences that scholars will have. And then therefore some of these more modern day complex issues, you actually find that essentially you can determine the different opinions by the different scholars. So yeah, of course, you have to go to the people of expertise. And this is, again, how, unfortunately, in our times, business seems to rule, whether it's in the financial world, whether it's in whether it's in our own industry. And there has to be, slow down. Let's get the experts together. Let's have them discuss these issues. And they have, alhamdulillah, many fiqh councils do. and then let's determine rulings, and then base your growth of your business and your standards on actual knowledge and research.
Okay, so now let's move to the global platform. You guys are local certification in the US. How do you look at the global halal sector or the global halal industry? Jalal, you've been around for a while. Do you think things have improved since 1970 in terms
Absolutely.
of getting closer, improvement in certification processes, auditing, and standardization? Do you think there has been any improvement at all?
I do, absolutely. And the thing is, just a little bit more about me is I'm an eternal optimist in many ways. I look at saying there's always an opportunity to get better, and part of that's maybe from more of a sports upbringing and such too, is that look, in anything you do, right? If you practice at it and you have good coaching, you're going to make positive improvements. And I think that's what's happening in our industry. It doesn't happen as fast as we hope. There's always going to be those obstacles in the way, but the reality is that, as I mentioned, even going back to what I mentioned from our court case, one of the challenges that we did not professionalize as fast as we should have. And I've taken that to heart in our current organization, and separation of responsibilities and compliance and so on. And that's something that, even with what Tariq had mentioned, asking experts in different areas, regardless of what the field is, whether it's digital marketing, or if it's in finance, or it's in human resources and employee development. The point is that our industry is growing, it's evolving, and it is evolving in a way where, look, we just, as a global population, have come out of a pandemic the last few years. There's tremendous energy out there to meet again with people, right? To come together and have discussions. There's a lot that we want to all say and get together and to go over. And I see these next few years as being perhaps some of the most accelerated growth in the education of our halal industry, and addressing matters head on without the controversies and without the finger pointing and such, to where we're explaining the values of why it's important to address halal standardization in such a way that also includes politics, that also includes trade, and helps to bring them to light in a very non-threatening and open environment. We may not all agree, and that's understandable, but the point is that we're going to come together and have communication and conversation.
And if I could have an opportunity to add to that, Dr. Awal, in theory, because you hear this a lot, right, that the halal industry should come up with one global standard, and that would be wonderful. But how realistic is it? Is there in the scientific field, is there one standard for accepting even that contentious issue that we spoke about? What is the cause of death, or how do we define death? And so, as ideal as that would be, there's only a couple of options, as I alluded to before. Either we just come up with one strict standard that everyone will have to get on board, and great if that's where we reach to. However, how practical is it? And that's not the way of our rich tradition in Islamic law. You had these differences of opinions because what might be then strict and applicable to many, it might be too difficult in certain parts of the world, where then they would never be able to receive halal food. And so if we have that within these very specific issues of not just the halal and Islamic slaughter, but across the board in different topics, marriage, divorce, differences of opinion, we have to acknowledge, and the scholars have been differing for 1,400 years. Believe me, they're going to continue to differ until the end of time. I do think there is an opportunity, though, and especially when you get on the global scale, because you'll have then certain countries that develop their standards. They're going to have their own set of scholars, scientists, experts that they listen to, who differ amongst themselves. They'll have their own political motivations, their own economic motivations. We have to consider that will influence their standards. And so I think it's better and a healthier approach to say that there are these differences, they will exist, so let's standardize them. Let's understand some of these differences. and on the points that we can all agree on with the advancement of technology and knowledge, and especially when they're in when they coincide with what scholars have already agreed upon, such as certain stunning methods, such as certain animal welfare issues, such as certain oversight and monitoring issues for halal certifiers, I think you can be very optimistic that there should be and can be points of agreement. But other than that, let's recognize that there will be these differences. And again, let's just identify them.
Now, one last question on the issue of death. You've mentioned it time and time again during this conversation. How do you think we can resolve this? Do you think we need a global scholars union, or do you think, or how do you think we can solve it?
I don't have an exact answer.
Yeah.
I do think that the more that the scientific community comes together to define death,
yeah,
the more that they become unified and take that to the scholars, then the better. But it is quite nuanced, because you will find even where the scholars will consider the definition of death or the ruling of death in certain chapters of fiqh, such as with regards to capital punishment, they will accept certain standards and definitions, whereas they might not when it comes to slaughter. And why? Because there are major fundamental differences.
Yeah.
It's not that they're contradicting themselves, but because the spirit of when you're talking about capital punishment is to protect human life.
Yeah.
Or inheritance. Where we won't necessarily rule that that person is dead, because now that means that his wife is separated from him, she can get remarried, the children can inherit. They're much more sensitive issues. Whereas in slaughter, for example, you have conflicting defaults. You have the default is that meat is not allowed unless known otherwise. But at the same time, you have that the meat is still considered wealth, and it is not allowed to allow wealth to just go to waste without a good reason. However, again, where there, when the scientific community can come in harmony more with regards to this issue, that will definitely help. And also, we don't necessarily need to say specifically that it's the brain or the heart. Will, if we just widen a little bit, as the scholars have done, where we're more concerned with the legal ruling. So let's say we can't fully decide if it's the brain or the heart, or we can't even decide if the animal's fully dead. But does it have signs that it's dying? And that's really what's more important. And that's what you find the scholars mention, what's called haraka madbuha. When you have an animal, when you slaughter it, and the natural reflexes and the kicking, for the majority of scholars, they would consider that to be a dead animal. They acknowledge that it's not fully dead yet, but that it's in the ruling of being dead. Now we can take that and say, okay, that if we have an animal that is captive bolt stunned, for example, cattle, and it has that violent reaction, or it's completely dead, or it doesn't react, or it's completely brain dead, but the heart is still beating, that will then be ruled, and it has all the signs of either a slaughtered animal or a dead animal, as per scientific, when it's research, when an animal is actually stunned properly. Then we can say the vast majority of scholars would rule that animal as dead, and Islamic slaughter would not benefit it, even if the heart is beating. Just as when you slaughter an animal without any stun, the heart is still beating, the heart is still pumping.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And it's considered slaughtered. So in this case, yes, there actually is more room for the scholars to come to agreement. If we don't look at it as black and white, what's considered dead, or what is absolutely reality dead and alive. No, what's in the ruling of life and death as well.
So before we finish, or before we end, I'm gonna invite Jalal to just give his final thoughts. Then I'll bring Tariq back for his final thought as well.
Thank you again, Dr. Awal, for the opportunity to be on the podcast today and to give some perspective to a number of events that have occurred in ISA's history, and also to give an opportunity to provide direction as to where, inshallah, we plan to go in the future. The last thing I think I would just like to leave everyone with is going, for those that are in the industry itself, we have a great opportunity to do good and to provide an educational base for the next generation. And in order to do that, bridging the science and the fiqh together is going to be critical. And among those, having the continued conversation among all other aspects of it. When you come together, whether it's us in the United States with the other certifiers or internationally, when you come together, look, everyone understands that there's competition, right? We're all in different businesses, and we still are a business at the end of the day, but we have also a greater representation that we have with the Muslim consumers out there that we have to uphold. And so the only way we're going to be able to do that is by continuing the discussions and also inviting the other players, the politicians that are involved, the trade associations, and so on. So I think I would just say that we'll continue to be part of that. We'll continue to reach out as best we can, and inshallah, we'll be all meeting with a higher degree of success as we go forward.
Thank you very much. Brother Tariq, what's your final
word? Very, very quickly, the power of the halal consumer. In these cases, number one, education is crucial. Yeah. How do you empower and have this movement, the halal demand, grow? It has to be organic for it to have longevity. And so the crucial step to that then is to educate on the importance of halal, educate on the different standards of halal, if you will, educate on how do we pass that on, and how do we demand from the producers to develop halal, or to, I should say, to actually produce halal or have halal as a viable option for the Muslim Ummah. But at the same time, the Muslim consumers have to know their role as well and their power in capitalistic markets. It's one thing to demand for halal and then learn about it and say, I want it. You have to have halal. It has to be halal certified, and then not be willing to pay the price. Understand what commodity kill is, and that the main goal is, kill as much as possible in the shortest amount of time to increase your profit. Understand that just like as you pay more for organic or all natural or non-GMO and all these other certified products with a higher quality, halal will also require that you pay a higher premium. So you have to be ready for that until the demand grows so much, then obviously that will bring the price down. Dr. Owen.
Thank you very much. Inshallah, we will meet again. I will keep you posted. If I need any clarification, inshallah, I'll come back to you.